Today I'm going to talk about water, and I would like to underline the use of plural, so waters, because the plurality of water is something that we need to consider in our work as a designer. So fragile water, because the water is a very fragile material and is involved in a plurality of fragilities. But water is also a material to be reinvented. So the topic of the lecture, the topics of the lecture are mainly three. The first one, we are going to talk about fragility, and this scenario of fragility, what kind of scenario is representing for the water design. Then we are talking about the plurality of water, so waters, and then we are talking about reinvention. So we are digging the role of the design, the role of the project into the design of waterscapes. First of all, we are living the fragility. So our life is characterized by time, geological time, that is a fragile period. And this scenario is involving complexity, uncertainness, and crisis. And here we need to find a very specific role for the design in this scenario. Sometimes it's very easy forgetting the specificity of design in order to answer some technical problems and technical issues, forgetting that the design is something more, because it's something that is coming from a double answer, that is on one side technical, but on the other side also artistic and humanistic. So we need to balance our work as designers, first of all, and architects. The scenario that we are living of fragility is not something new. In 1972, a group of scholars from US published this book that is called The Limits to Grow, that is nowadays very famous, but at the beginning it was quietly, how to say, not recognized in its importance by the global system of the culture, because of a very dense content and critical content. Basically, this book was telling something very simple to understand, that the growing process that was going on in the 70s was too accelerated, too strong, too fast, and it was creating some conditions representing a possible crisis, disaster in the future of the next 50 years. So the message was very urgent, and we can have a look to some diagrams, understanding what kind of topics they were commenting. First of all, the increasing of population, then the decrease of natural resources, the increase of the price and the decrease of the availability of food, and also the decrease of the industrial output, and of course the increase of pollution. So this diagram projection for disaster were representing that in the 70s they were thinking that the year around 2000 was the beginning of this very huge crisis, and the crisis was going on in more or less growing a lot in the 50 years after 2000. So now we are at, how to say, in the first third of this process, according to the book. And the diagram of world urban population is demonstrating something that nowadays is well known, the increasing of the number of people, and also another problem that we are commenting shortly about the concentration of population in the huge urbanized areas. But also some other topics, like for example, the use of fertilizers and the dynamics about arable land. All these aspects nowadays are widely discussed, and they are concerning a lot the topic of water, because as you know, you had before a lecture about the problem of depuration of water, and the fertilizer were one of the most involved problems in the dynamics of water also in our region, in Lombardia. So all these topics were involving water, but the message was, okay, we need urgently to change our attitude, but no one did this kind of urgent rethinking. And we went on for more than 30 years without thinking a lot the problem of sustainability. Nowadays, we are in a context where all the forecastings of that books are reality. So we need to, how to say, to deal with this topic. And this is really interesting because it's also explaining how sometimes the academia is anticipating something that is not visible in the reality, so a sort of latent necessity. And about, for example, the increasing of population, this book that is very famous, Urbanization of World, or I don't know if there is the English translation, I didn't find it. It's the Urbanization of World, is explaining how the population is concentrating in very huge areas and very huge megalopolis. So you can see the map with all the most dense areas of the world. And this is also a topic that is involving water, especially in terms of stress of the water environment, but also talking about the huge megalopolis, the problem of managing the water inside of the city. So all the process of water management. But I'm sure that you spoke a lot about this kind of topics. And then, sorry, but the slide is not going on. Okay. What we are living nowadays? We are living a new era that they called Anthropocene. That is a proposed name for a new geological era. As you know, the geologists are using these names for naming some eras that are lasting a very long period of time. So Anthropocene is the new era where, for the first time, the processes that are changing the comprehensive working of the environment are not depending on natural phenomena, but are depending on anthropogenic phenomena, so phenomena created by the humankind. And so basically, we were able in the last years to create some processes that nowadays are addressing in a different way the course of the natural order of our planet. And this book that is called Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet is very interesting because it's proposing in my opinion, a definition of, at the end, the problem of design, that is answering this necessity of living on a damaged planet. And so designing is going to be an art of living on a damaged planet. And the book actually is not focusing on solutions, but is showing the context of disaster, and is doing it talking about ghosts and monsters. So ghosts as something that is not completely visible, but you can perceive the presence of this god, and monsters are more evident. And for example, you can see the one page where there is the nuclear power that for sure is one of the incredible forces that change our relationship with nature. And so now we need to find the balance for living this kind of situation and working in this complex scenario of the Anthropocene. So arts of living, because it's necessary, it is art, because this situation is treating our survival, and living on a damaged planet. That can we repair, can we improve, and how to do this? And this is for sure an interdisciplinary problem. And so what is the role, specific role of architects and designers in this scenario? The scenario of crisis is for sure involving the problem of climate change. The climate change is creating a situation where we need to find some answers to the problem of trend that is a negative trend, and we can we cannot stop this trend, but we can try to find some solutions. And the climate change is involving a lot of instability, creating a very unstable situation. And the relationship between, as you know, because I know that you already spoke about several topics, so many of these topics are not new, but the problem of instability and our work as designer is creating a very complex scenario where to operate. And this is a very challenging field, where I think is very important finding also new ways of dealing with the problems of the conditions created by climate change. But we are going to speak in a short time about the specific relationship between climate change and water, and reflecting on the role of design in this scenario. This book by Bruno Latour, I think, is quite interesting. For this reason, I put it the cover here, because it's challenging ourselves in the debate about climate change, talking about a real challenge between humankind and nature in this complex balance. And then we are going back to the 70s. So it's like a very short tour. And we are going to an Italian book by a professor of architecture that was teaching at Politecnico di Milano, Thomas Maldonado. In 1971, he wrote this book that is called La Speranza Progettuale, Ambiente e Società. So it's like the design hope in English, environment and society. It's a very interesting book about the role of the design. And of course, Maldonado was dealing with the problem of crisis that was starting in that period. And he explained in the book that the mistreatment that we were afflicting to the environment was creating a very complex situation where the people at the time were adopting two different attitudes. One part of the population were saying, okay, the crisis is starting, but we cannot do anything. We are going on, and when the world will finish, is gone, and we are not living anymore as humans, and so what do we need to do? Just going on. And the other part was made of people critically assuming the problem and trying to find a solution. And Maldonado said something that is very important, in my opinion, also compared to our work. And he say, for us, so for designers or people involved in the design, there is only one possibility: to reject again everything that can threaten human survival, to help to neutralize the time bombs. The time bombs were these ecological problems, this ecological crisis. And this intent corresponds to react to the irresponsible growth with the responsible control, to the congestion with management. In short, our choice is design. And it's very, very important, reflecting how more or less 50 years ago, Maldonado was writing something that nowadays we are discussing as something extremely up to date: the problem of the control of growing, and this responsible control, and the problem of congestion and how to manage the congestion. And so the congestion also in these very huge populated areas. And so our choice is design, and design is exactly this hoping that Maldonado is putting in the title of the book. So what can we say? Nothing new, but a lot of things that during the time were not understood completely, were not assumed as real problems. And nowadays, the crisis, that line that they were putting in the first book, is not anymore at that point of the 70s, but grew up. And so our problem of dealing with this fragility is for sure increased. And to together with the fragility of the overall condition of the environment, we have also a crisis inside of the specificity of our culture, no? And so continuous fighting between the idea of growing and the how to say, the ghost of degrowing, that is like challenging the different attitudes. There are people that they are continuously going on the idea of a continuous growing process, and other people that they are conscious of the necessity of a degrowing process. So, and this is, of course, involving our studies. And then let's go more deep towards the topic of water, the plurality of water, but also the double aspect of water. It's a very rich material, but in the same time is a controversial element. And nowadays more controversial because assumed in a context of fragility. So behind this very simple formula, no, that is the formula of the water, there is a reality that is very complex. And I would like to start from the past. Here we are going really at the beginning of the civilization. Those are crannogs, constructions typical of the Scottish area. And there were primitive huts, basically based on palafittes on the water. And this is representative of these complex relations between humankind and water. So the necessity of water and the advantages of water, and in the same time also the dangerousness of water and the variability of water. And the crannogs were representing a sort of field in between. No? The water was offering protection, insulation from the environment that was more dangerous than the water itself, but also it was representing a challenge in order to build this kind of very specific constructions. And we have the remains now that are representing this very important story of construction and management of water and the relationship between soil and water. And this kind of complex balance between nature and naturality and artificiality is at the base of the relationship with water, but is also involving another topic, that is the nature, the sacrality of water, the sacredness of water. And this book that is very beautiful, but only in Italian and also not available in Italian very easily because it's out of print since a very long time, is by an anthropologist, Anita Seppilli, that is called the Sacralità dell'acqua e sacrilegio dei ponti. That means sacrality of water and the sacrilege of the bridges. And is explaining basically an anthropological description of the role of the bridge that is really explaining very well this kind of complex relationship of the humankind with the element of water, and the complex relationship between the water as something belonging to our daily life, and on the other side belonging to something that is not controllable, that is at the time was completely considered as something belonging to sacrality, to God, you know, of water. And Anita Seppilli explained how the construction of the bridges was involving a very complex series of anthropological problems and questions. First of all, the idea of changing the direction of the water. So if the river is a line with a direction, the bridge is an opposite direction to the water. So crossing the water was representing the break of this sacrality. So also from the Latin, Greek poets and Roman poems, we can find the traces of this sacrality. Hesiod said, "Never cross the sweet flowing water or ever rolling rivers afoot until you have prayed, gazing into the soft flood, and wash your hands in the clear, lovely water." whoever crosses a river with hands unwashed or weakness, the gods are angry with him and bring trouble upon him afterwards. So this is explaining how at the beginning of the time was difficult dealing with the problem of designing water. But this is also telling something that is useful for ourselves nowadays, that water is still representing a field where there is this suspension between our abilities, our technical abilities, and the necessity of controlling something that is still maintaining something that we cannot control. And this is more evident in time of climate change, in this time of crisis, because, you know, every every season we have news about flooding, disasters, events that are related to this impossibility of controlling the water. So we are still living in this kind of scenario. And I like this painting because it's representing really the fragility of also the construction of the water architecture. You know, the bridge is something really representing our force, our human imposition on nature. And there are some hypotheses about, for example, the architecture of the Romans and the aqueducts, where the quality of the architecture is representing, according to some theories, the answer to this power of the water. So we are dealing with a very powerful materia, and in the same time we are building an architecture that is dignifying our relationship with water. So we are paying also paying for the damage that we inflicted on the nature. So it's this kind of relationship. So the quality of architecture is an answer also to the problem of dealing with a very fragile and very complicated materia. And this relationship between naturality and artificiality is still extremely important. There is a very beautiful book by Gillo Dorflex that is called Nature and Artifice, where basically Dorflex is explaining how losing this relationship between losing the ability of thinking about this relationship between naturality and artificiality is creating the conditions for some possible disasters where we are not able to deal anymore. And at the end, we need to think this, because nowadays the effects of climate change and so on are the answer to the nature, to our attitude. And so how can we deal with this complexity? And talking about rivers and water, logically the rivers and the waters in general are constructions, are a project of architecture, because since the beginning the humankind tried to modify the landscape of water. Here we can see some representations from the 17th century about the corrections, the transformation of the river Tiber in Rome. And so the idea was working with the materials that were available, a very fragile architecture of riverscape design, not really able to change in a definitive way the nature of river. But according to this process and the variability, the natural variability of water, people grew up in their techniques. Here we can see, for example, the palimpsest created by the river Po in the south of Cremona, where we can see is the palimpsest itself into the traces of the agricultural landscape. So the powerful of the river in modifying itself and the ability of adapting the transformation of the territorial order. But the nature itself was in the Renaissance, for example, adapted to the artificial design of the city. Here we can see how the profiles, the shapes of the ideal cities were adapting the river to the design of the artificial environment of the urbanity. So the river is modeled. There is a space for the river in the city that is exactly corresponding to the space of the road and the urban fabric, and the river is transformed into construction of architecture. And this process went on very well for several centuries. Leonardo was reflecting on this kind of topics. Now, you know, the profiles of the ideal cities with this system of different levels, the waters, the control. So also the construction of artificial waterways in order to create this very complex environment. But also the aesthetic use of the water. Here we are in Padua, the famous Prato della Valle, where basically some canals were introduced into the design of this space, and the water is the element that is creating the unity of this system. But we are talking about a time where the city was controlled in terms of dimension, shape, and the processes were very slow and were proceeding, keeping the value of the natural element very high in the consideration of people, and the transformations were, how to say, controlled. But with the development of the techniques and the growing of the cities, this process changed completely. And so we went towards a period of fast transformations that in some cases created the starting point of our condition of crisis. Here we can see, for example, the canalization of a river. This is something about Canada, Ontario, but the process is the same in many countries all over the world, where the complexity of the natural element was reduced into an artificial design. And nowadays, this is exactly the point where we need to work. We are in a very delicate moment where this kind of situations requires to go back towards a more controlled relationship between naturality and artificiality. And if we are exploring, we can find this kind of situation with different scales, but everywhere in the world. Here we are in Los Angeles, we are in Mexico City, and we are very close to Milano, where the Molgora stream is constructed into two huge concrete banks, and without any kind of relationship with the landscape. So how to deal with this problem that is not just a problem of hydraulic security, but is also a problem of landscape and quality of the environment that we are living every day. And this is for sure related to the process of urbanization and the sprawl, all the phenomena related to urbanization. I like this drawing by Cedric Price that is comparing the city to an egg. I don't know if you have ever seen this one. So the ancient city has a boiled egg, then a fried egg, and today scrambled eggs. So in these scrambled eggs, we have a plurality of waters that is running around. Now we spoke about rivers, the transformation of rivers, the processes, and also the cultural dimension that changed completely. No? So from the Renaissance, the idea of domesticating the nature and making the nature part of an artificial design, to the idea of artificializing the nature in order to make possible this growing process. And nowadays we have the idea of the metabolism. So the city is so complex, so extended, so articulated, and is a never-ending situation in many cases that is involving not only the water of rivers, but the water coming from other sources and the water in the metabolism of the city. So this is the real scenario where we are dealing nowadays. Sometimes we are not thinking to some types of water, no, starting from the water that we are the tap that we are opening in our kitchen, but we are not thinking, for example, of rivers that are not existing anymore because they are buried under the level of the city. London, Paris are full of streams, the rivers completely buried under the roads, but also in Milano we have this kind of conditions. And all this system is representing a very complex scenario and a very fragile scenario, because as you know, probably from also from other lectures, the problem of rivers is not separated from the problem of sewage. The problem of the metabolism of water and the control of the water into the urban environment is not separated from the problem of pollution and the problem of availability of fresh water. So it's a very complex series of conditions that is well expressed by this word metabolism. So I would like to underline some conditions that are very important in my reflection about the water. The first one is the problem of neglection and disaffection. And this is really related to our discipline. So the attitude of the humankind towards water produced this condition of neglection and disaffection. So nowadays we have a lot of situations that need a recover, and this is going also towards a sort of aesthetical point of view. So how to rebuild the landscape of water that nowadays sometimes missing. And then we have some problems more related to the availability of water and the management of water. So the climate change is introducing this problem of excess of water in some conditions and deficit of water in other conditions. So is the wars that you can see in the that sort of domino, no? Flood, fire, drought, storm. So we are always listening about these kind of topics. And then there is a very important relationship for designer, that is the relationship between soil and water, especially in very dense urban regions. So how to deal with this problem. And then there is another phenomenon that is more political, but is also involving ourselves, that is disputation of water or water grabbing. This is less known than the others, but there are really some fights for the water all over the world, especially in the places where water is not available anymore. And so we need to think very well about this resource and how to make the water, how to guarantee the availability of water for the future generation, because the risk is losing the water. Also in regions where we have a lot of water, like for example the Po Plain, because the water in the Po Plain is subject to some problems that are affecting the availability of groundwater. We are now digging very, very deep in order to have fresh water, hundreds of meters under the ground, reaching some sources that are not renewable because they are like fossil waters that we are using. So this is the scenario of fragility. And here we need to find our specific role as architects and designers. So sometimes it's too easy, you know, talking about some toolbox where we say, okay, we are creating rain gardens, we are creating some situations where the water can store for a while, depurating, but this is a problem, a technical problem. But how all these kind of aspects are creating a new landscape, a new environment, a new idea of the city. So this is the answer that we need to find. And we need to change our attitude towards water. So from presence to resource, from a material of urban and open landscape as an actor of complexity. So how to use the water is the center of new challenging forms of relationship. One element of beauty, this is something that is very difficult to discuss in the contemporary theory about design, but we need also to deal with beauty. That's a point. A matter of form, because the water doesn't have a form, but the container of the water is a form. And so how to think this material, no? And then the systemic properties of the water, that is not only ecosystem, but is also the multiplicity of relationship created by water, also in terms of livability of water and the role of the water in the landscape. And then materials for landscape innovation. We can create new landscapes using water. So this is some of the challenging questions, but how to do this? I decided to change a bit the standard kind of presentation, and I say, okay, let's talk about tools that are necessary for this reinvention of water. Invention in the idea of discovering something new. And this is something not new in our discipline. Le Corbusier, in one of the last notes he wrote a few years before the death, he died in 1965, so this is from 1963, he wrote the key is to look, observe, see, imagine, invent, create. So what I would like to underline is that all these kind of problems have some technical answers that nowadays are very well explained, and they are also belonging to sometimes other fields of disciplines. And so our role as designer is also to understand the landscape of water, to understand what water is representing in the complexity of the architecture of the environment and the architecture of the city, and following these kind of steps, the observation as an exercise in order to understand and rethink something. And this observation is involving, first of all, criticizing and using these kind of steps that are very important. So observation, that is different than seeing, because before we are observing, then we are seeing when we can start understanding something. And imagination, invention as the way of creating something new. And now it's very going very briefly about some topics, but for example, I work on this kind of topics, and I think one of the first steps of this process is re-involving ourselves in the dynamics of the world. And so we need to, for example, to walk, and the walk is then representing having a direct experience of the places that we are studying. Sometime, for example, talking about waterscapes, we are plenty of good intentions. For example, when we are talking about river contracts, politics about rivers, but rarely we are reading about direct contact of the people that are writing these kind of documents with the reality of places, the involvement in places. It's also a different scale, but we need really to understand the places, measuring the places with our body and walking in the landscape. There are architects doing this. For example, Vogt landscape architects is using this technique of walking in order to understanding, and the walk is the first step of a design process. Walking is involving also the use of our hand, sketching, in order to understand. This is very, how to say, sometimes boring, not to say, but this is really a necessity in order to reconnect our mind with the environment. And reflecting on other tools like the mapping, mapping as a way of representing the complexity, and also the cross-section that in my work is very important, and the tomography as a series of cross-section that are representing the complexity of a specific situation. And all these tools are the tools that are linking some problems to the origins of our discipline. For example, these drawings are coming from a work on the Naviglio Grande, where I tried to describe the complexity of the construction, the architectural construction of this canal. And the series of cross-section are explaining the multiplicity of water. So we have a canal, but we have also waters taken from the canal that are creating other smaller canals that in the same space, but with a little difference, are creating other kind of landscapes and are dealing with new kind of grounds that are modifying. So the construction of the water infrastructure is in the same time the design of a specific environment. And this work, for example, of description and the investigation of this canal is teaching a lot of interesting things about how to rethink the role of the water in the city as a pattern, as a continuity, as a sort of system that is creating relationship between different places. And the cross-section is extremely important, for example, in order to underline the different levels, the relationship between the different kind of waters, the relationship between the water and the artifacts involved into the design of the landscape. And sometimes it's very difficult making, for example, when I'm teaching, it's very difficult making the people, the students discovering these kind of powerful potentialities that is inside of a system for drawing until they are not dealing with the design of the cross-section and understanding how this representation is then introducing the prefiguration of another reality. Because when we are going to understand how does it work, we can start understanding how we can do. And this is representing a form of continuity between past and present. So the analyzing the past is teaching something for the future in a sort of renovation of this system. Of course, other techniques are useful, for example, axonometry, and we have plenty of books about the powerfulness of these representation tools, as well as photography, that in my opinion is very important because it's able to explain and to give another visible form to the reality that we are describing. And this process of description is not separated from the process of designing. I think the role of design should be also a little different than in the past. In the past, for example, we had a lot of architects doing serious explorations and descriptions of the reality before the redesign of the reality. But this process was hidden, put it into a drawer in their studio and not made public. It was the preparation for the design. And what we know is the design itself. Also, if you are going to dig, for example, in the work of Le Corbusier, you are discovering a lot of sketches about the places that are not part of the main knowledge about his work, but it was necessary for the approach of the place. Nowadays, we need to transform this process of description into something that we are communicating to the society, because the society are required to regain a knowledge of the landscape. For example, here we are describing the axis of the Naviglio Grande. That is a very well-known canal and is very famous. And there are hundreds of books about the Naviglio Grande, but the attention is always focused on some specific topics, like, for example, the villas, like, for example, the cities along the canal, the activities that they were doing on the canal, transportation of goods, boats, navigation, but no one is investigating how it's made and what's happening around the canal. So how the landscape changed after the construction of the canal and how the landscape is shaped on the presence of water. So this is what I tried to do, for example, changing a bit the perception of the canal in one specific part of the canal. And I did also one exhibition, and it was very funny from my point of view, because the photograph that I put it in the exhibition were like these photos, and the people they visited the exhibition, they told me, but why you didn't put the photos of the villas? I say, because I am not interested to talk about the villas, because everyone knows about that. But no one knew, for example, about the different materials or what's behind the banks of the canal, no? That with some relationship that are very important, but they are totally new. So how to discover a new landscape also, speaking of something that is extremely visible and well known. But this work is interesting for exploring many different kind of situations, no? So relationship between photos, sections, maps is a field, an open field to explore, always with new kind of intentions. And this kind of communication is opening for then the creative process of design. So that invention that is depending also on the discovery of what we have in front of us. For example, I'm teaching in the course of landscape architecture, and there's plenty of students that they are thinking that the GIS can answer any kind of question. But at the end, you are discovering that the scale and the process of GIS is not so perfect. And you need always to use yourself, you know, in the reality. And then, if we are going towards a more technical problem, for example, here we have a very, how to say, classical representation of what can we do for rethinking the role of water in the urban environment. So mitigation measures, more space for the river, retain and infiltrate, disconnect surface water from the combined sewer system, store, reuse, and infiltrate rainwater. We are discovering that, yeah, all these basic processes are happening where? On a cross section, and in that very thin line that is separating the underground and the air, the place where we are living, no, the surface of the land, and that these kind of processes are very easy to understand, but what is the real difficulty is understanding, okay, but how can we do this and what kind of shapes can be involved? And I think this is a very challenging topic that we need to understand. And this is also a little the aim of my exploration. So the description, the comprehension of the environment is extremely important in order to address this kind of processes, in order to make them part of our landscape and also able to renovate the landscape of our cities, offering something new, something that we need still to discover, but not like a real adaptation, but more a reinvention of the city. And if we are going to I think the last slide, we are I think this is quite interesting because it's a transition. This is by Christian Nolf, the transition from the original landscape to a new landscape, thinking of water and water space. So we can see 3 steps. No? So the middle one is the present and the criticalities of the present. The top one, the upper one, is the past, and then the future. And the cross-section is the comparison between these 3 steps. But what is very important is the reflection that is going from the present to the past and then to the future. That is involving all the processes that we discussed. So the idea of, first of all, studying and understanding the landscape, its evolution, in order to deal with the loss of complexity in one term and the increase in complexity in the other terms, because we are dealing always with different forms of complexity, comparing to the present and understanding how it can be in the future. No? And the drawing at the end is the way that we have in order to dig this reality, understanding and then representing the future. So it's 3 different topics that we discussed, but they are linked by, at the end, our work. So this design hope that Maldonado was explaining, that I think is also a desire at the end of rethinking our discipline and the specificity of our discipline, that is this ability of understanding and rethinking and forecasting a new future in the forms of the design. So that's the end of the presentation.